This is Alec Hoffman at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara. The Center is now the main activity of the Fund for the Republic. The studies of the Center are chiefly directed at discovering how a free and just society may be maintained under the strikingly new political, social, economic, and technological conditions of the second half of the 20th century. The method of study is dialogue and discussion. Here is the way Robert M. Hutchins, chairman of the Center, explained to an audience in Chicago recently how public discussions affect public issues.
The Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions is a group of men meeting continuously and trying to think, I will not say how successfully, about the most urgent problems which, in their opinion, now confront us. The purpose of the organization is not merely to think, not merely to try to think together, not merely to offer a model of an intellectual community or to suggest how the dialogue may be carried on and the civilization of the dialogue achieved. The purpose of the Center is to try to clarify the most important issues that we now face and to try to get these issues discussed by those who may in some way or other determine what shall be done about them. Now, I think nobody really knows how things happen in a democratic society. I have asked my colleagues in Santa Barbara time and time again to explain to me the course of English history from 1750 to 1850, and so far I've got no response. In 1750, in the administration of Sir Robert Walpole, England was a sink of iniquity. The country was it was exploited by the great families for their own benefit. It was absolutely beyond the imagination of any Englishman at that time that any civil servant should ever earn his salt. Horace Walpole had sinecures that I estimate would be worth in current funds something like $200,000 a year, and never had to go to work. He never had to go near the office, and neither did anybody else, and nobody thought that it was in any sense out of the way. As Adam Smith and Edward Gibbon pointed out, Oxford and Cambridge in the 18th century were both sunk in a sea of port. Adam Smith recommended that the professors live on fees rather than on endowments, in the expectation that this might induce some of them to go to work. Now, by 1850, England is a model of public administration, and the British universities set the intellectual tone for the Western world. How was this done? Such explanation as one can think of does give us some hope that the process in which we are engaged in Santa Barbara, in which we are engaged here in Chicago today, may have somewhat comparable results. Burke began to attack the placemen and Walpole's administration and all, not Walpole's specific administration, but Walpole's tradition around 1780 and 1790. This campaign got rolling. People got to talking for the first time. They began to imagine for the first time a system under which different from the one under which they had been brought up. And so the object of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions is to start and to keep going, if possible, discussions of precisely this type. We are concerned with foreign policy. We are concerned with the American character. We are concerned with the structure and functioning of constitutional democratic government. We are concerned with the city. We are concerned with a national policy for education, as distinguished from the presentation of omnibus bills on that subject. And we are concerned with law, jurisprudence, and the Bill of Rights, because we observe that enormous changes are now going on under the leadership of that aged or aging group of lawyers, the Supreme Court of the United States, and that these changes are going to mean, apparently, that whatever the attitude of the law toward the economic system may be, we are about to enter into a period of national standards of morality, of social conduct, and of criminal procedure. Our object is to try to see if we can think things out for ourselves, not because we want to educate ourselves, well, that's always nice, but because we think if we can think things out for ourselves, we may be able to get the kind of movement rolling that took England from 1750 to 1850. We do believe that we confront a totally new world. We believe that the rate of change is unexampled. We believe that it is only by taking thought that we may hope to save the West and perpetuate those ideals of freedom and justice to which we are all dedicated.
That was Robert Hutchins explaining the purpose of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. In the broadcast that follows, we will take you again into the conference room of the Center, where you will hear Philip Rieff, professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, author of Mind of a Moralist, and presently in residence at the Center, suggest that it is time to reconsider some of the assumptions that are widely accepted about the problem of black and white in America. Professor Rieff views most of the sociological analysis in the country today as obscuring the real issues. It is, says Professor Rieff, a white man's sociology. Granted, a liberal white man's sociology, but a white man's sociology nonetheless. Professor Rieff.
There's been an enormous amount of scholarly beard-pulling, in particular among members of my own discipline, about the problem of black and white in America. In fact, it was practically our only subject until fairly recently. The Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago was in large measure responsible for the study of the American dilemma. I suggest that first, a great deal has happened since Myrdal's summing up, and second, because in important respects Myrdal was wrong, and the summing up was misleading. And so I want to address myself first to the major element in Myrdal's summing up. What was the old diagnoses of the problems of the relation between black and white in America? Myrdal's summing up was expectable within the American liberal tradition. I think it consisted of the following thesis: that there is, in fact, a fracture in the American system between its creedal values and its practice. That if only we could enforce those creedal values, democracy, equal treatment, and so forth, bring practice into harmony with those creedal values, the American dilemma would be resolved. I think that the thesis itself, supported by the tremendous amount of research that the Myrdal tome reports, 2 generations of the work of American sociology, that this thesis on the fracture is very difficult to use analytically because of its naive assumptions about the American creed. And it is to those naive assumptions that I want to talk first. If the split exists, it must be analyzed in a way somewhat, I think, more complex than the one Myrdal suggested. For the American creedal values have been long understood, I suggest, as something one does not experience, as distinct entities, like goods and services, to be preached on Sunday, and perhaps even to be ritually practiced on Sunday. But they are part, in some significant aspects, of the Sunday religion of America. It would be a mere mechanical problem to extend them to the other 7 days of the week, which is generally what the prescription calls for, 6 days of the week. There must be another kind of calendar. But this notion of the problem is largely one of the mechanical expansion of the Sunday religion of America to the other 6 days of the week, ignores the dynamics of the creed itself. The creed confirms this dualism between the seventh day and the other 6 days. It isn't simply an insufficiency in the creed, but the characteristic element in the creed itself that makes it a Sunday religion. The dualism of ideals and experience is in fact confirmed by the creed, I suggest. Ideals refer to goals and purposes, not to action and means. Thus, the culture system, with its dualism of creed and practice, really confirms the social system. It doesn't oppose the social system as the Myrdal thesis had it. So there's a weakness in the analysis of the creedal or ideological dynamics of American life that I think we would have to re-examine specifically in terms of the race problem in America. Now, what alternatives are there to this kind of analysis? And I want to begin this effort to break away from the white liberal sociology of race relations with a motto statement. The motto is taken from Volume 2, Chapter 21 of the greatest authority still on American society and culture, two terms that I don't treat as mere synonyms, Tocqueville. Tocqueville wrote in that chapter, in a passage you undoubtedly remember, as follows: "If ever America undergoes great revolutions, they will be brought about by the presence of the black race on the soil of the United States. That is to say, they will owe their origin not to the equality, but to the inequality of condition." I think that this revolution to which Tocqueville referred as the likeliest great revolution to occur in America is now well underway. And it is the task of the scholarly community and social sciences to understand the dynamics of this revolution. In order to understand these dynamics, I propose that an additional motto be added to this discussion from Aristotle. Aristotle writes, "Every state is a community of some kind. He who by nature and not by mere human accident is without a state is either a bad man or above humanity." I suggest that the political theory of race relations in this country has wanted this Aristotelian wisdom, that it has failed to recognize that every state is a community, that the great revolution now being conducted by the black man is to use the state as an avenue into membership in the American community from which he has been excluded. Whether this is the correct strategy or not is another subject for precise and systematic discussion. There have been two major views on how to conduct a revolution in Western history. The one view I would call Christian, in which you don't attend directly to changes in the social system, but rather in what a sociological theory rightly calls the cultural system. Jesus and the early Christian leadership was not concerned with destroying the Roman Empire. They were concerned with what we would now call a revolution in the culture system, in the system of meaning and value, of sentiment and attitude in life. The Marxist tradition operates in exactly the opposite way. The only way to overthrow the culture system is by, in fact, a revolution in the social system. No other revolution is great or profound. The resolution of these two quite different theories, I think, is a theoretical necessity in the true understanding of the great revolution now occurring in America today, the revolution of the black race. It is clear that the official leadership of the blacks have adopted the theory for which Marx is the greatest articulator, that essentially what you seek are transformations of the social system. I don't want here to push this antinomy too far, because the Marxist analysis of the social system is such that any genuine revolution in the social system means a complete transformation in the emotional relations of men, and in consequence, it must be simultaneously a revolution in the culture system. Nevertheless, in a much narrower sense, the official Negro leadership is asking only for changes in the social system. This is linked to yet another dichotomy that I think has been established both in the popular mind of America and in the minds of its social sciences, a dichotomy that I find very difficult to use. This is the dichotomy, both in theory and practice, between revolution and evolution. It is assumed somehow that the politics of change most appropriate to our society is the evolutionary one. I think that this evolutionary dogma is a curse analytically, whatever it may be strategically. For analytically, it has obscured our notion of what social change really means. I think social change involves such decisive actions as cannot be treated analogically to the organic unfolding of some process in nature. It involves conflict, as the Marxists know better than we. It involves action which, because it is action, is swift. It is only in retrospect, viewed from the isolated professional towers, that social change becomes evolutionary, only in such historical retrospect. But it usually involves, however unintended the consequence and obscure the end, conscious, purposeful action. That is what social change means existentially. That's what it must mean to the actors and the interests involved. It also means, in every social change, in every social system, that there are new winners and new losers. And the evolutionary hypothesis, rather than the revolutionary one, tends to obscure the fact that there are always new winners and new losers. The Southerners are our new losers. We may judge that what they're losing is not worth keeping, but what they are losing is clearly important to them and cannot be maintained if and when the Negroes win. And their victory is, I think, by no means assured. What is being lost, then? What would the new losers be losing, however inarticulately they may understand this loss? I think Cash and many other students of the Southern way of life have understood this very well. And I think Tocqueville understood it too. For despite our democratic the patina of democratic ideology, there are residues of the aristocratic sentiment deeply ingrained in American life, regionally so, most profoundly in the South. And I want here to distinguish the problems of the South from those in the northern urban areas, which I reserve to a somewhat later point, although at a certain point they converge. Tocqueville, of course, was tracing the Great Revolution in Western political and cultural history, that Great Revolution being from aristocracy to democracy, not merely politically, but also culturally, not only in the social system, but in the Parsonian dichotomy, in the cultural system. The Negro represents a residue of the aristocratic system, of an older social and cultural system. How does he represent this residue? Because he is the man who, by definition, is pinned down by his social status, which is also merged with his racial status. In a society driving toward democracy, the Negro becomes a safety valve, if you will, understood psychologically. He becomes a residual category. He becomes the one area in a democracy in which it becomes more and more difficult to define one's own individuality, to identify oneself, in which it becomes easy to identify oneself. As Cash rightly understood, every Southern white, whether a Virginia gentleman or an Atlanta cracker, at least knew that he was above, even if he spent all day on his back, above every Negro, no matter how tall every Negro stood. That's the aristocratic bias built into, dialectically, our system. So that the ambiguity of defining the I, myself, in a democracy, the man stripped of his status masks, could be in part cosseted by the fact that in one area of American life at least, the status mask remained fixed in the Negro, in the black-white relation. That's been very important to American life. The Negro thus represents an important function in the American social and psychological economy. He is representative of the reluctance to face life stripped of this final status mask, which stripping is by implication the consequence of full democracy. Those for whom the status mask is exceedingly important find that stripping painful and resist it violently. Thus, the problem of black and white in America and the resolution of the problem is intimately linked with the realization of full democracy in America. This is what Tocqueville had in mind, I believe, although he doesn't make the point explicitly, when he prophesies that the one and only great revolution likely to occur in American culture is the revolution of the black man. In my interpretation of this and extension of this Tocquevillian insight, it conforms to his general theory of the transition in the West from aristocratic to democratic forms. Now, full citizenship involves fellowship. I think this is what Aristotle had in mind. It involves communal membership. The political problem, or the problems of change in the social system, can not be isolated, if the analysis is to be valuable, from the problems of change in the cultural system. Again, using those terms as the sociologists do. The special problem in America is that even our well-disposed polemicists or theoreticians of the problem of black and white, like Myrdal, refuse to see this interdependence, refuse to see because they don't understand political theory, refuse to see the degree to which the admission of the Negro to the full privileges and protections of membership in the state must also involve him in the community, in the fellowship. There is a further problem here, and that is the degree to which this conception of community as necessary as a fundament of all political systems has been, in fact, been eliminated from both our political theory and our sentiments. And this is a problem to which I really can't speak here, but it's a very important one. That is, the way in which we conceive of the social and political order and its relations to the community, understanding that word to mean membership and fellowship, a democracy of the emotions, must be analyzed in terms of the white community and then with special reference to the special pathos of the problem of race in America. There's a special problem for the white community here. The leadership of the white community, as it has achieved a certain emancipation from the older aristocratic forms of self-identity, as it has achieved a certain individuality, has at the same time, by this very concentration on itself, the rich, the well-to-do, the well-educated in this country are in fact deeply reluctant to confront the Negro problem because their very emancipation makes the Negro problem irrelevant to them. As they have achieved a richness both externally and in their private lives through psychoanalysis and art, this richness of the private life has in fact obliterated their public life. These are residual problems of an older culture system to which they no longer really belong. The involvement of the rich in their private lives, best expressed by their attitudes toward psychoanalysis and art, is clearly involved because the leadership of the white community suffers under the strain of having to attend to problems that are not personally real. The problems of exclusion of the Negro from the community really are a parody, a mirror parody, of the problems of emancipation from community characteristic of the upper crust culture classes in this country. So there is no leadership from the white community, in fact, or a reluctant and deliberately ignorant one. Moreover, so far as this status element does remain built into the American social system, how is the white community to give it up and to live democratically? This is a tremendous psychological and cultural problem because it itself is in no cultural condition to lead or even aid a revolution, the kind of revolution to which Tocqueville referred. Every revolution or missionary movement, to the best of Max Weber's knowledge, or any other sociologists I know, comes from below, not from above. How can the whites, the educated liberals, or the conservative whites, who are in one way or another either psychologically sprung loose from this problem or trapped by aristocratic self-conceptions, how can the whites, who are therefore in one sense or the other above this problem, reform themselves out of existence? How can they help in the revolution? I'm not sure they can. I think only the black men can save them by recalling them to the public role, which I think is genuinely unimportant to them in American society today.
Harry Ashmore, who was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for his editorials on civil rights, is the first to comment on Professor Rieff's proposal. Mr. Ashmore points out that sociologists have also neglected to deal with the lack of cohesion among Negro groups, who have in common only their sense of alienation.
I agree with Bill that there are revolutionary implications of this. I would not entirely agree, I think, with his description of what they are. And the fact that I do disagree, I think, after having looked at this fairly closely, if not as a sociologist, indicates the value of the kind of work that he's proposing. For example, I have argued for quite a long time, unscientifically, but I think correctly, that one of the reasons you will have a different kind of revolution, if there is one, from the Negro minority in this country, is a unique circumstance that there is no cultural unity in this minority, effectively speaking. It, in my observation, is conditioned by a kind of corrupted version of the standards and values of the white community, starting in the South and carried over now into the great cities. The only unity that I can see there, and I think it's different in this regard from any other minority that we've ever had to accommodate in this country or deal with, is that the only unity seems to be based on alienation. Once that alienation is reduced, then the unity begins to disappear. This is an observation I couldn't sustain. I think it's one of the kind of things that ought to be looked at. I don't, as I read the literature, popular and to some degree sociological, find this kind of thing being examined very well.
Richard Lichtman, professor of philosophy, suggests a study of black and white in America ought to include also a study of the nature of prejudice.
I just want to ask Mr. Rieff whether he thinks it would be valuable, because I do think it would be valuable, to involve in this study what I can only call basically a phenomenological approach to the nature of prejudice, and I can best illustrate it rather than try to describe it. I mean the kind of approach to prejudice that was offered by Marx, for example, in The Jewish Problem, and was offered by Sartre in that little book on anti-Semitism and the Jew. You know, that kind of approach which begins with a study of the nature of the conscious experience of prejudice and also includes some kind of, in Sartre's case, some kind of psychoanalytic observations. I think that would be extremely useful to this kind of study. I think the problem of prejudice might be further enlightened if it were put on this kind of level where it was not simply the problem of the Negro, because, you know, from Sartre's point of view, the Jew in some sense is an external appendage to the problem of prejudice. In another sense, on a sense which I couldn't argue here, but philosophically, the Negro may be an appendage to the problem of prejudice too, and consequently, whatever one can derive from studies like Sartre's about the nature of prejudice, and I don't think there are very many, I think would be useful if we could make any sense of them here. I just would like to have your comment on that if you would give to me.
I haven't thought about this, Dick, in terms of anti-Semite and Jew book, but I certainly think that the much misunderstood Marxist analysis on the Jewish question, which you relate evidently to the Sartrean, I think would be most promising. So I would agree that this kind of approach, quite different from the structural approaches of American social science and American liberalism, would lead to insights of a different order. The linking of phenomenological and psychoanalytic approaches implicit in your question seems to me to be promising.
William Gorman, philosopher and an editor of the great books of the Western world, thinks Professor Rieff's proposal to re-examine the problem of the Negro raises in sharp context those issues about democracy to which the center consistently addresses itself.
And your distinction between the state and the community, surely you could easily have documented that with a long-standing ambiguity about the term democracy as regards its extent, which is a part of the American tradition of thought about that term or concept. That is to say, in Dewey and in others, but in Dewey primarily, the notion that democracy must be released from being part of the traditional analysis of forms of government and must be a much deeper idea, and somehow it has implications that must be pervasive through the society and is not confined to citizenship and the obligations and privileges thereof and the forms and procedures of government. That, I think, is an important aspect of the discussion of democracy in America. Important in itself, unresolved on its own level, quite apart from the Negro problem. And you have, in large part, in your remarks, from me at any rate, this is what I hear, you have stated that the Negro problem raises that issue in our time with extraordinary tension. And I think you're perfectly correct in that case. That is, when you commented on whether or not it was the right strategy for the Negroes to be using the political process as a solution for the problems in the order of community, which is wider. You said you would revert to that, but you didn't make any more remarks on that. But I'm right, am I not, that it's central to the structure of your remarks this morning, this distinction. Since I contend that it's central to the American discussion of democracy as to how far the obligations implicit in this term and our presumed devotion to the experiment in democracy, I consider that you have related the Negro problem to that discussion, which is our central problem, because it does raise, this is the answer I catch, because it does raise, in a most remarkably tense and vigorous and demanding way, issues about democracy.
You have been listening to excerpts from a meeting addressed by Philip Rieff, professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, author of Mind of a Moralist, and presently in residence at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Commenting on Professor Rieff's proposal for a new study of the Negro in America were Harry Ashmore, Richard Lichtman, and William Gorman. The meeting was recorded at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in February 1963, a few months before the demonstrations in Birmingham. This is Hal Kaufman in Santa Barbara.